Las Vegas, mid-1970s. Elvis was halfway through a packed show when a young woman in the front row held up a cracked vinyl record. Security moved to stop her, but Elvis waved them off. He walked straight toward her, white jumpsuit catching the light, and the crowd went silent. If you believe moments like this show why Elvis was more than a performer, stick with this story. And if it moves you, share it with someone who remembers the power of real kindness. The house lights were low, the air heavy with smoke, and the sound of forks scraping plates carried faintly across the Vegas showroom. It was the mid-1970s, and Elvis Presley had been on stage less than an hour, dressed in a gleaming white jumpsuit with blue stones catching the spotlight. The room was alive with rhythm until suddenly he stopped. Elvis raised his left hand. The band froze mid. Horn players dropped their instruments from their lips. The guitarist's last chord hung awkwardly in the air before dying into silence. The audience murmured, unsure if this was part of the show. Then came the disruption, a commotion near the front row. Ushers moved quickly, leaning in toward a young woman clutching something against her chest. Under the sharp spotlight, a shimmer of black vinyl caught the light, but it wasn't smooth. Its edge was cracked, jagged, clearly broken. Some witnesses recall the woman trying to push closer, her hands trembling as she held the sleeve forward. A cracked record in the middle of an Elvis Presley show. In Las Vegas, where every second was timed and polished, this was unheard of. Elvis's gaze locked on her. He lowered his hand, signaling the ushers to stop. The crowd hushed instantly. Forks paused mid-air, cocktail glasses frozen halfway to lips. People leaned forward, squinting, waiting to see what had caught his attention. He stepped forward, boots striking the stage in slow rhythm. Each step carried a weight that pressed the entire room into silence. The spotlight followed him, dust swirling in the beam. From the balcony to the back wall, 1,800 people held their breath. The woman's shoulders quivered as Elvis drew closer. The broken record sleeve bent slightly under the strain of her grip. The cardboard edges were frayed, its printing faded by years of use. Even from the stage, Elvis seemed to recognize it wasn't new. The micro-moment that night burned into memory. Elvis extended one finger, pointing directly at her. Not at the ushers. Not at the crowd. At her. With a small nod, he motioned for them to let her through. The ushers hesitated, then pulled back. Gasps rippled through the audience. This wasn't rehearsal. This wasn't part of the act. The king had stopped an entire performance for a single fan carrying something broken. A murmur swept the room. Why her? Why now? The orchestra members looked at each other, confusion etched across their faces. The drummer tapped a quiet roll, waiting for a cue that never came. The pianist hovered above the keys, hands frozen in mid-air. The young woman inched closer to the stage. Her shoes scuffed against the carpet, echoing faintly in the sudden stillness. The air conditioning hummed overhead. Every sound felt magnified, stretched. Some in the back rows leaned so far forward that chairs creaked. The energy in the room shifted, confusion turning into anticipation. People could feel something unusual was about to unfold. Elvis kept his eyes fixed on her, expression unreadable, as though testing the weight of the moment. His hand, still extended, slowly lowered. The band, still frozen, followed his every move. And then, with a small shake of his head, Elvis took a step closer to the edge of the stage. The spotlight narrowed, centering on the distance between them, The king and a trembling fan with a broken record. No one knew what he would do. Would he take it? Would he dismiss her? All anyone knew was that a show built on spectacle had turned into something real, fragile, and unpredictable. Why would Elvis Presley stop an entire show for a cracked vinyl record held out by a stranger? She stood frozen at the foot of the stage, her breath quick and uneven. For a moment, it looked as though she might collapse under the weight of so many eyes. Then, with trembling hands, she lifted it higher the broken vinyl that had stopped Elvis Presley in his tracks. The room seemed to lean toward her. Witnesses recall the spotlight catching her tear-streaked face, mascara running down in uneven lines. The sleeve she held wasn't glossy or new. It was worn, its corners bent, the cardboard soft from years of being touched. And inside, the record itself, 45 revolutions per minute single, was fractured nearly in half. The jagged line cut across the label like a scar. Security kept a close eye on her, but Elvis waved them back again, crouching slightly at the edge of the stage. "What do you have there, honey?" His voice, though soft, carried across the hushed room. Her words stumbled out between sobs. According to those seated nearby, she explained that the record was Love Me Tender. It had once belonged to her older brother. He had played it endlessly, night after night, until the grooves had worn thin. He'd promised her one day they would see Elvis live together, but he never made it. He had passed away months earlier, and this cracked record was all she had left of him. The audience shifted uneasily in their seats. The story spilled across the room like a current. Some gasped, others lowered their heads. Elvis's eyes never left her face. He listened, nodding gently, his expression softening as the weight of her words settled in. In that silence, even the hum of the amplifiers seemed louder, the faint hiss of the speakers filling the void. One man at a nearby table later said he could smell the faint scent of old cardboard when the girl pulled the record from its sleeve, dust and smoke clinging to it, as if it carried the memory of 100 nights spent in a bedroom where her brother had let it spin. The girl's hands shook so hard that the cracked pieces of vinyl rattled against each other. She pressed them tighter, desperate to keep them together, and then came the micro-moment that seared itself into memory. Elvis reached down, his fingers brushing against hers as he steadied the sleeve. He didn't take it yet. He simply held it there with her, acknowledging the weight it carried. A murmur passed through the crowd, as though everyone exhaled at once, but tension still lingered. This was a concert in Las Vegas, a spectacle of lights and sound, every beat rehearsed, every gesture planned. To stop for a fan's story was unusual. To let it reshape the night was unthinkable. Open loop planted. Would Elvis move on with the show, leaving her to hold her grief alone, or would he honor what she had brought? The girl's voice broke as she whispered, "He wanted to hear you sing it." Just once, Elvis's jaw tightened. He glanced back at the band, then to the cracked record in his hand. The spotlight warmed the rhinestones across his shoulders, sparkling against the deep hush of the room. The decision hung there, thick as smoke. As every person waited for the king to make his move, would Elvis dismiss the moment and return to the performance, or transform it into something unforgettable? Elvis stayed crouched at the edge of the stage, the fractured vinyl trembling between his fingers. The girl's words lingered in the air, her brother's memory, his unkept promise, the broken record that carried it all. For a moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched so long that some in the audience began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Then, with a steady breath, Elvis did something no one expected. He reached down fully, letting his hand brush hers as he took the broken record from her grasp. Gasps rippled through the room. The jagged edge of the vinyl glinted under the hot spotlight like a scar across its surface. According to witnesses, Elvis turned it slowly in his hands, as though reading its story. His thumb traced the crack from label to edge, pausing over the faded letters that spelled "Love Me Tender." In that instant, the showroom disappeared. The lights, the band, the crowd was just Elvis, the girl, and the memory she had carried to him. The band remained frozen. Guitars hung silent against chests, brass instruments gleamed untouched. The drummer's sticks hovered above the snare but never struck. One eyewitness recalled hearing the faint buzz of the amplifiers in the absence of music, the sound normally buried under layers of melody now filling the void. Finally, Elvis looked up at the girl. His voice, low and certain, carried across the hushed arena. "This isn't broken," he said, holding the cracked vinyl high enough for the crowd to see. "It's loved." The room erupted not in cheers, but in a collective gasp, followed by stunned silence. People turned to one another, some wiping at their eyes. A woman in the balcony clutched her husband's hand so tightly he winced. Micro moment, Elvis pressed the record gently against his chest, right over his heart. He closed his eyes for a brief second, as though feeling the pulse of memory in its fractured grooves. He opened them again and shifted his gaze back to the crowd. "Every scar tells a story," he added softly, almost to himself. The tension in the room shifted from grief to anticipation. What would he do next? Would he give the record back and continue the show, or would he rewrite the night around this fragile object? The girl stood motionless, tears streaming, unsure if she should reach for it or step back. Elvis rose slowly to his full height, rhinestones scattering light in every direction. He turned toward the microphone stand, the broken record still in his hand. The crowd leaned forward as one. Ushers along the aisles froze in place, eyes wide. Even the stagehands in the wings held their breath. According to reports, Elvis tapped the microphone lightly, the hollow thud echoing across the room. He glanced at the band, then shook his head. No music. Not yet. And here came the open loop, the shift that hooked everyone deeper. Witnesses recall Elvis lowering the record onto the edge of the piano, setting it down as though it were a sacred object. His hand lingered there for a beat too long before he pulled away. Then he turned back to the girl, locking eyes with her. The intensity of his stare made it clear this was not a passing gesture. Something was coming. Mid-roll teaser moment lands here. What he did next would turn a broken piece of vinyl into a legendary memory. The crowd knew they were seconds away from something unscripted, something no ticket price could buy. Elvis gripped the microphone stand, leaned forward, and drew a deep breath. His lips parted, but before the first note escaped, he looked back once more at the broken record resting on the piano, the crack glinting in the light, with the entire room holding its breath. Elvis turned back to the microphone. What would he do? Elvis gripped the microphone, his knuckles white against the chrome. For a long second, he didn't move. Then, without cueing the band, he leaned forward and let the first quiet words escape. "Love me, tender. Love me, sweet." The sound was fragile, stripped down to its essence. No guitar, no drums, no horns, just Elvis, his voice carrying through the hush of the showroom. The silence was so complete that even the hum of the air conditioning felt loud, blending with the faint buzz of the stage lights overhead. The girl's sobs quieted, her eyes fixed on him. The cracked record sat on the piano beside him, its jagged line catching the light like a wound made visible. Every person in that room felt the weight of it, one broken object holding the story of a life. Elvis kept his eyes on her as he sang. He didn't scan the crowd. He didn't strike a rehearsed pose. This was not for the thousands in the room. It was for her. He drew out the final note of the first line, his voice soft but unwavering, carrying the ache of memory. Witnesses later recalled people dabbing at their eyes with napkins, some holding hands across tables. The usual clinking of glasses and whispered conversations that marked a Vegas show were gone. Halfway through the verse, Elvis paused. He reached across and lifted the broken vinyl high above his head. The crowd gasped again, watching the fractured record glint beneath the golden stage lights. Then, holding it steady, he continued, "Never let me go." The image was unforgettable. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, singing to a grieving fan while raising a cracked record like it was an offering. Micro-dash, sensory beat. Rhinestones on his cuff flickered as his arm trembled slightly under the light. A faint rustle spread through the crowd as people shifted forward in their seats, drawn closer by the intimacy of the moment. The girl clasped her hands to her mouth. Unable to breathe through her tears, Elvis finished the verse, letting the final note fade into the silence. No applause followed at first, just stillness, a pause so deep that the air itself seemed to hold back. Then, softly, he repeated the line one more time, his voice breaking on the final word. "Love me tender." And he stopped. For a heartbeat, the entire room remained frozen. Then came the emotional shift. Muffled sobs rising from scattered tables, followed by a swell of applause. It began as a ripple and grew into a wave, sweeping from the front row to the balcony. People stood, hands pounding together, some crying openly, others stunned into silence even as they clapped. But Elvis wasn't finished. He lowered the record, set it gently back on the piano, and draped one of his scarves over it. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The gesture was clear. What was broken was now made whole, honored and seen. The band looked at him, waiting. Elvis shook his head again. No music yet. He wasn't ready to return to the show. He bent toward the girl, speaking words that only she could hear. Witnesses recall seeing her nod, clutching her chest as if to keep her heart from falling apart. Open loop planted here. Whatever he whispered stayed between them. But the true impact of this night wouldn't end here. Something else was coming. The spotlight lingered on Elvis as he stepped back to center stage. His breathing was heavy, his chest rising beneath the rhinestone suit. He stared out at the audience, eyes shining, then gave the faintest nod. The crowd knew they had witnessed something that went beyond music, but Elvis still wasn't done honoring that broken record. What came next would transform silence into legacy. The final note of "Love Me Tender" still lingered in the air when Elvis moved toward the piano again. The cracked record sat beneath the stage lights, a scarf draped gently across it. For a moment, he simply stood there, one hand resting on the microphone stand, breathing heavily. The crowd remained standing, applause swelling and falling like waves against a shore. Then Elvis leaned down. He lifted the broken record once more, balancing it carefully so the audience could see. The scarf slid halfway off, hanging like a ribbon. He raised it high and said just 4 words, his voice firm but soft. "Now it's complete." The room erupted. Applause thundered through the showroom, louder than anything that night. People were on their feet, clapping, whistling, shouting his name. Some cried openly, others simply shook their heads in disbelief. The moment had shifted from grief to celebration. The cracked record transformed into a symbol of love honored in front of thousands. Eyewitnesses recall the microbeat just before the eruption. A hush, as if the entire room inhaled at once, holding breath until the words left his mouth. Then the release came, a roar of emotion too powerful to contain. Elvis placed the record back on the piano, resting it gently as if it were fragile glass. The scarf remained draped across it, glowing gold under the spotlight. The girl pressed her hands to her face, sobbing into them. According to those nearby, she nearly collapsed back into her seat, overwhelmed by what had just unfolded. The band, still frozen, looked at one another, unsure when to resume. Elvis gave a small nod, finally signaling them back into place. A guitarist strummed softly. The drummer tapped the hi-hat, easing the audience from one world back into another. But even as the music returned, nothing could break the spell of what had just happened. Microsensory cues, people wiping their eyes with cocktail napkins, the smell of cigarette smoke thick in the room, the glint of rhinestones bouncing off mirrored walls. The ordinary textures of a Vegas showroom felt different, now charged, alive, unforgettable. Elvis returned to the center of the stage, but his eyes went back to the piano again and again. The cracked record, still visible, wasn't just an object anymore. It had become the night's heartbeat. One fan in the balcony later recalled, "It was like he gave that girl's brother back to her just for a song." As the set continued, the crowd remained on edge, clapping louder, leaning in closer, carried by the weight of what they had just witnessed. People knew they were part of something unscripted, a story that would live far beyond the showroom walls. Open loop planted. What happened after the concert would prove that Elvis wasn't finished with the broken record. The moment on stage was powerful, but the story wasn't over. Eyewitnesses say that when the show ended, ushers guided the girl carefully out of the crowd, some patting her on the shoulder as she passed. Other fans reached for her, whispering words of comfort, telling her she had given them all a gift that night. As Elvis left the stage, he glanced once more at the piano. The cracked vinyl and the scarf remained where he had placed them. He gave a slight bow of his head before disappearing into the wings. A week later, far from the lights of Las Vegas, that broken record would take on an entirely new life. The Las Vegas concert ended, but the story of the broken record didn't. For most fans, that night lived only in memory. But for the young woman, the moment was only the beginning, according to friends close to her. About a week later, a package arrived at her home. The box was plain, with no return address. She opened it cautiously, hands trembling, still raw from the night when Elvis had turned her grief into music. Inside was a brand new 45 revolutions per minute vinyl of Love Me Tender. The sleeve was crisp, its corners sharp, the cardboard carrying the faint smell of fresh ink and paper. Nestled inside, the record gleamed and cracked, untouched, flawless. But that wasn't all. Across the front of the sleeve, in bold, looping handwriting, was Elvis Presley's signature. Below it, a note in his hand. "Some records aren't broken. They're remembered. You'll always have a seat in the front row." The young woman collapsed into a chair, clutching the record to her chest. Witnesses later said she wept for hours, this time not from grief, but from the overwhelming sense that her brother's love had been honored, immortalized by the man he had adored most. Word of the gesture spread quietly at first, friends telling friends. Fans whispering about the girl who had handed Elvis a broken record and received something greater in return. But as the story circulated, it became legend. Proof that Elvis Presley saw more than crowds and ticket stubs. He saw people. He saw pain. And when given the chance, he turned it into connection. Micro moment of legacy, one fan remembered. That cracked record was a scar. Elvis made it a crown. The act wasn't televised. It wasn't staged. It didn't sell records or fill theaters. It was private, personal, a reminder that kindness can echo louder than music. And that is why the story lives on, not just as a tale of a broken vinyl, but as evidence of a man who, for all his fame, never forgot to stop, to see, to care. The night in Las Vegas was unforgettable, but the week after the package, the signature, the note that was the twist that turned a moment into a legacy. Sometimes what feels broken is simply waiting for someone to recognize its meaning. The girl never let go of that signed record. It stayed with her for life. A reminder that love, even cracked and fragile, can still sing. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes kindness can stop a room and echo through time. And tell me in the comments, what's one keepsake you'd never let go of, no matter how broken?